11:14 a.m., January 11th, 1944, 24,000 feet above Oschersleben, Germany. The outside air temperature is 50 degrees below zero. Inside the cramped ball turret of the B-17 Hells Angels, Staff Sergeant William Thompson is watching a massacre. The 401st Bomb Group has been stripped of its escort. The combat box, the defensive formation, designed to be an impenetrable fortress, is breaking apart. 30 Luftwaffe fighters, a lethal mix of Focke-Wulf, 190 seconds, and Messerschmitt, 109 seconds, are queuing up to tear the bombers to pieces. The Americans are deep in the Reich, and they are completely alone. 4,000 feet above the carnage, Major James Howard circles in a P-51 Mustang named Ding Hao. His radio is dead. His wingman is lost. He is the only American fighter pilot in the sky for 100 miles. According to 8th Air Force doctrine, a lone fighter facing 30 enemy aircraft has one standing order: disengage and survive. To fight is mathematical suicide. But Howard doesn't turn west. He slams the throttle of his Packard Merlin engine to war emergency power and dives directly into the swarm. To understand how one pilot intended to fight an entire Luftwaffe wing and why the fatal flaw in his own aircraft almost killed him before the Germans, could we have to look inside the wings of the P-51 itself. But before we examine the mechanical failure inside Howard's wing, we must understand the strategic failure that put him there in the first place. The crisis of 1943 wasn't about guns. It was about geography and the cruel arithmetic of fuel consumption that was bleeding the 8th Air Force dry. 3 months prior to Howard's lone stand, the United States Army Air Forces faced an existential reckoning. It was known as Black Thursday. On the 14th of October 1943, 291 B-17 Flying Fortresses launched a massive raid against the ball-bearing factories at Schweinfurt. The logic of the American commanders was stubborn and bloody. Heavily armed bombers, flying in tight combat box formations, could defend themselves without fighter escort. They were wrong. The Luftwaffe was waiting. General of Fighters Adolf Galland had assembled a massive force of interceptors. The moment the American fighter escorts hit their fuel limit and turned back, the German pilots pounced. They used rockets, cannons, and even aerial bombing to break the formations. By sunset, 60 B-17 seconds had been shot down. Another 17 were damaged beyond repair. 600 airmen, an entire infantry battalion's worth of men, were erased from the roster in a single afternoon. The morale at bases across East Anglia collapsed. Empty bunks filled the barracks. The mess halls grew quieter every morning. The crews weren't cowards. They were mathematicians. They knew that with a loss rate of 20% per mission, statistically, a crew member would be dead or captured before his 15th flight. The tour of duty was 25. The problem was the escort gap. The Americans possessed excellent fighter aircraft, but they were built for the wrong war. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, affectionately known as the Jug, was a monster of a machine. It was heavily armored, armed with 8 50 caliber machine guns, and could dive faster than anything in the sky. But the P-47 was designed as a high-altitude interceptor to defend American cities, not a long-range escort to invade Germany. The Thunderbolt's massive Pratt & Whitney R-2800 radial engine was thirsty. Even with external fuel tanks, the paper drop tanks that hung under the belly, the P-47 seconds could only escort the bombers as far as the German border, roughly 375 miles from England. This created a deadly routine. The American fighter pilots, men like Hubert Hub Zemke of the 56th Fighter Group, would fly alongside the big friends as far as Aachen. But then, the physics of combustion would intervene. The fuel gauges would drop. The flight leaders would rock their wings, signaling the recall. And as the Thunderbolts banked 180 degrees to return to England, the bomber crews would watch them go with a sinking sense of doom. Just beyond that invisible line in the sky, the Luftwaffe Jagdgeschwader fighter wings were circling like sharks at a drop-off. They knew exactly where the P-47 seconds had to turn back. They didn't even bother engaging the fighters. They simply waited for them to leave. The situation with the P-38 Lightning was even more frustrating. The twin-engine fighter had the theoretical range to go deeper, but in the freezing high-altitude air over Europe, it was a technical nightmare. The cockpit heating systems failed, leaving pilots with frostbitten hands and feet, unable to feel the controls. The Allison engines, optimized for the warm, dense air of the Pacific, often threw rods or detonated in the thin, -60-degree air over the Reich. The P-38 wasn't the answer. General Ira Eaker, commander of the 8th Air Force, was backed into a corner. The British RAF Bomber Command had already switched to night bombing, arguing that daylight raids were suicide. Washington was pressuring Eaker to do the same. But precision bombing the kind needed to destroy specific factories like the Focke-Wulf plant at Oschersleben required daylight. The planners faced an impossible engineering contradiction. To survive against the nimble German Bf 109 seconds, you needed a small, agile fighter. But to fly from London to Berlin and back a round trip of nearly 1,200 miles, you needed the fuel capacity of a bomber. You can't build a fighter with the range of a bomber, the skeptics argued. It would be too heavy to fight. The Luftwaffe believed this was an immutable law of physics. Hermann Göring, the head of the Luftwaffe, famously stated that he would know the war was lost when he saw American fighters over Berlin. To the German High Command, the idea of a single-engine fighter appearing deep inside the Reich was as ridiculous as a submarine appearing in the Alps. But while the brass in Washington argued and the crews in England died, a solution was sitting on a tarmac in California, ignored and misunderstood. It was a bastard aircraft, a hybrid born of British desperation and American manufacturing genius. It was the North American P-51 Mustang, specifically the P-51B. The early versions of the Mustang, the A models, had been underwhelming. They used an Allison engine that choked at high altitude, relegating them to low-level reconnaissance and ground attack. But then, someone had the heretical idea to rip out the American engine and replace it with the heart of a Spitfire, the Rolls-Royce Merlin 61. The result was aerodynamic alchemy. The Merlin engine, with its two-stage supercharger, allowed the Mustang to breathe at 30,000 feet. But the real magic was in the airframe itself. The P-51 utilized a laminar flow wing, a revolutionary design that smoothed the airflow and drastically reduced drag. This meant the plane sliced through the air with a fraction of the power required by the bulky P-47. Less power meant less fuel burned. Less fuel burned meant range. When engineers added a massive 85-gallon fuselage tank behind the pilot's seat, the P-51B's range stretched to impossible numbers. It could go to Berlin, it could go to Poland, it could go anywhere. But there was a catch. There is always a catch in engineering. To fit that range and performance into such a sleek, small airframe, the designers had to make compromises. The cockpit was cramped. The rear fuselage tank, when full, shifted the center of gravity dangerously aft, making the plane unstable and prone to snapping into a spin if the pilot wasn't careful. And, most critically for Major James Howard on that frozen morning in January, the thin, efficient laminar flow wings didn't have enough room for the machine guns to stand upright. The guns had to be mounted on their sides, fed by ammunition belts that twisted through a sharp, agonizing curve. It was a mechanical time bomb, ticking away inside the wing, waiting for the stress of combat to set it off. And on January 11th, 1944, as the first group of Pioneer Mustangs crossed the German border, they weren't just testing a new plane. They were testing the very concept that a fighter could survive this deep in hell. Leading them was James Howard, a man who didn't care about the skepticism of the brass or the laws of aerial warfare, because he had already learned a very different set of rules in the skies over Burma. Major James Howard was a statistical anomaly in the European theater. While the fresh lieutenants arriving in England had cut their teeth on training manuals written in safety, Howard had spent 1,941 and 1,942 flying for the American Volunteer Group, the legendary Flying Tigers, in the burning skies over Burma and China. This distinction was critical because the air war in Asia was a fundamentally different beast than the one in Europe. In Europe, pilots were taught formation discipline and mutual support. In China, Howard had learned a darker, more primal physics. The Japanese A6M0 and the Nakajima Ki-27 Nate could outturn anything the Americans built. Flying the heavy, rugged P-40 Warhawk, Howard learned quickly that if he tried to dogfight a Japanese pilot in a horizontal turn, he was a dead man. The Zero would simply pivot on its wingtip and slide behind him before he completed a quarter of a circle. To survive, Howard and the Tigers adopted a tactic known as boom and zoom. It was a doctrine of vertical energy. The P-40 was a brick, but it was a brick that could dive at 400 miles per hour. Howard learned to loiter high above the fight, roll over, and scream down on his target, firing a short, violent burst before using that accumulated speed to zoom back up into the safety of altitude. He treated the sky not as a flat arena, but as a roller coaster of potential energy. He didn't fight with the plane, he fought with physics. By the time he transferred to the Army Air Forces and arrived in England, Howard was already an ace with 6 confirmed kills. He was 30 years old, an old man, by fighter pilot standards, and he carried a quiet, lethal competence that unnerved the younger pilots. He named his new plane Ding Hao, a Chinese phrase he'd picked up from the locals. It meant number 1, or very good. But the machine he painted that name on was unlike anything he had flown in China. The P-51 Mustang was the bastard child of international desperation. The British had the best engine in the world, the Rolls-Royce Merlin, but they didn't have an airframe with the range to carry it to Berlin. The Americans had the airframe North American Aviation's sleek P-51, but its original Allison engine was asthmatic above 15,000 feet. When American engineers at Packard finally married the two, stuffing the license-built Packard V1000 650 Merlin into the Mustang's nose, they created a paradox. To the logistics officers and heavy bomber generals, the P-51B was a logistical headache. It was liquid-cooled, meaning a single bullet to the radiator would drain the coolant, seize the engine, and turn the plane into a glider in minutes. The P-47 Thunderbolt, with its air-cooled radial engine, could absorb massive punishment and keep flying. Why, the brass argued, should we trust our boys to a fragile racehorse when they could drive a tank? To James Howard, however, the P-51B was a revelation. It was the P-40's energy tactics perfected. The Mustang wasn't just fast, it was slippery. Its laminar flow wing reduced turbulence to a whisper. In a dive, it didn't buffet and shake like the older fighters. It accelerated with terrifying smoothness. It could outdive the German Bf-109, and unlike the P-40, it had the power-to-weight ratio to climb with them too. But as Howard's unit, the 354th Fighter Group, prepared for its combat debut, they were branded with a moniker that felt more like a warning than a compliment. The Pioneer Mustang Group. They were the guinea pigs. No one knew if a single-engine fighter could actually function reliably for 6 hours at 30,000 feet. The temperatures at that altitude hovered around -60 degrees Fahrenheit. Oil thickened into sludge. Hydraulic lines froze, rubber seals shattered. And the pilot, sitting in a tiny, unheated plexiglass bubble, faced hypoxia and frostbite that could lead to gangrene. The skepticism from the bomber crews was palpable. They had seen the P-38 Lightnings try long-range escort and fail. They had seen the P-47 seconds turn back. When the 354th arrived, the bomber gunners looked at the slender, elegant Mustang and saw a toy, not a shield. Howard ignored the noise. He spent his time studying the new aircraft with the obsessive detail of an engineer. He understood that the P-51B gave him the one thing he had craved over China, the initiative. In the P-40, he was always defensive, reacting to the Zero's superior maneuverability. In the Mustang, he could dictate the terms of the engagement. On the morning of January 11th, the mission briefing at Boxted Airfield was grim. The target was the Focke-Wulf assembly plant at Oschersleben, deep in central Germany. The weather was atrocious. The bomber stream would be flying through a frozen soup of contrails and cloud layers. As Howard walked out to Ding Hao, his ground crew was wrestling with the cold. The Merlin engine sputtered and coughed, the cold oil resisting the pistons. Howard climbed in, the cockpit smelling of high-octane fuel and cold aluminum. He clamped his oxygen mask tight, checking the flow. He didn't know it yet, but the Pioneer label was about to be tested in the most violent way possible. The engineers had given him a plane that could reach Berlin, and he had the tactical brain to fight there. But inside the thin, high-speed wings of Ding Hao, a design oversight lay dormant, a mechanical gremlin waiting for the G-forces of combat to wake it up. Howard taxied out, the four-bladed propeller clawing at the heavy winter air. He was bringing a knife to a gunfight, but he knew exactly how to use it. The question wasn't whether he could fly the plane, it was whether the plane could survive the way he flew. That survival would hinge on a mechanical gamble that the engineers in California had unwittingly lost months earlier. As Howard climbed through 20,000 feet, leaving the gray chop of the English Channel behind, he was sitting atop a design compromise that was invisible to the naked eye, but glaringly obvious to the laws of physics. The P-51B's laminar flow wing was a masterpiece of aerodynamics, thin and tapered like a knife blade to slice through the air with minimal drag. But this thinness created a severe packaging problem. There simply wasn't enough vertical space inside the wing to mount the 4 heavy Browning M2 50 caliber machine guns in their standard upright position. To make them fit, the designers had been forced to tilt the guns onto their sides, burying them deep within the wing structure. This decision forced the ammunition belts to travel along a tortuous, serpentine path. Instead of feeding straight into the breech, the belts had to snake out of the ammunition boxes, twist through a sharp, 90-degree stainless steel feed chute, and then execute a final hairpin turn into the gun itself. On the ground, or in straight and level flight during testing, the electric feed boosters worked perfectly. The rounds flowed smoothly. But combat is not level flight. In a high-speed dogfight, a pilot pulls G-load gravitational force. In a tight 7G turn, the pilot's body weighs 7 times its normal weight. Blood drains from the brain. Limbs feel like lead. But physics applies to the machine just as it applies to the man. Inside the wing, the 30-pound belt of ammunition suddenly weighs over 200 pounds. When Howard would inevitably haul back on the stick to track a German fighter, that heavy belt would be crushed against the bottom of the feed chute. The electric motors, struggling to pull this sudden dead weight around that sharp, restrictive corner, would burn out or simply fail to overcome the friction. The belt would snag. The gun would cycle once, find no round in the chamber, and fall silent. It was a glass jaw. The Mustang was the finest boxer in the ring, but if it threw a hook too hard, it would break its own hand. As the 354th Fighter Group crossed into German airspace, the weather began to conspire with the mechanics. The temperature plummeted to 50 degrees below zero. The oil coating the gun actions thickened into a glue-like paste. The metal tolerances in the breeches tightened as the steel contracted. Then, the chaos began. A garbled recall order went out from headquarters due to the deteriorating weather. Most of the fighter escorts turned back, but the 354th, either missing the call or ignoring it in the static, pressed on. They were the pioneer group, and pioneers don't turn around. But the confusion fractured the unit. Flights got separated in the cloud layers. Wingmen lost their leaders. By the time the bomber stream approached the target area at Oschersleben, the cohesive protection of the fighter group had dissolved. Howard broke out of the cloud deck at 24,000 feet and found himself in a terrifying solitude. The sky, which should have been filled with friendly olive-drab fighters, was empty. Below him, the B-17 seconds of the 401st Bomb Group were trudging along like slow, heavy beetles, and swarming around them were the silhouette shapes of the Luftwaffe. He saw the dark crosses. He saw the flashes of 20mm cannon fire sparkling against the silver skins of the bombers. A rational assessment of the situation dictated an immediate withdrawal. He was one man against an entire Jagdgeschwader. He had no wingman to check his 6 o'clock. He was flying a plane known for its fragility, armed with guns that were prone to jamming, deep in enemy territory where bailout meant certain capture or death. But Howard didn't calculate the odds. He calculated the energy state. He spotted a Focke-Wulf 190 climbing to attack a straggling B-17. The German pilot was fixated on the bomber, climbing slow and heavy. Howard was thousands of feet above, cruising at high speed. He rolled the Mustang inverted. This was the moment of truth, not for his courage, but for the feed chutes. Howard pulled the nose through the horizon and let gravity take over. The Mustang accelerated like a falling safe. The airspeed indicator wound past 400, then 450 miles per hour. The airframe stiffened as the air grew dense. The Focke-Wulf grew larger in his gun sight, filling the ring. Howard closed to within 200 yards. He squeezed the trigger. The 4 Brownings roared to life, sending a convergence of armor-piercing incendiary rounds smashing into the German fighter. The FW-190 shuddered, pieces of its cowling flying off as the rounds found the engine. The German pilot broke hard right, diving away. Howard instinctively yanked back on the stick to follow the turn, loading the airframe with G-forces. He needed to secure the kill. He pressed the trigger again. Thump. Silence. The vibration in the airframe stopped. The roar was replaced by the screaming wind of the slipstream. He checked his gun switches. Everything was on. He charged the weapons, hoping to clear the stoppage. He fired again. 2 guns barked for a split second and then choked. The physics of the turn had won. The ammunition belts, weighed down by the G-force of his maneuver, had pinned themselves against the chute walls. The feed motors couldn't pull them. Howard leveled out, shaking the aircraft to try and loosen the belts. He was now in the middle of a German formation, flying a plane that had effectively become an unarmed cloudy day racer. He had fuel, he had speed, but he had no teeth. Below him, the German pilots, realizing the lone American's fire had stopped, began to regroup. They saw a single Mustang, clearly having technical trouble, isolated and vulnerable. They turned their noses toward him, sensing an easy kill. The B-17 crews watched from their turrets, expecting the inevitable fireball. But James Howard did not turn for England. He checked his airspeed, looked at the wall of enemy fighters turning to crush him, and decided that if he couldn't be a shooter, he would be a projectile. That projectile came screaming down from the sun at 450 miles per hour. Howard didn't try to match the turning radius of the Messerschmitts. He simply slashed through their formation like a guillotine blade. He leveled out momentarily, the cold air forcing the jammed feed mechanisms to release just enough slack for two guns to fire. He caught a BF 109 inches, his convergence point, the precise distance where his bullet streams met, and saw the enemy canopy shatter. Before the debris had even cleared, Howard hauled back on the stick, trading his massive airspeed for altitude, rocketing back up into the thin air where the heavy, radial engine Focke-Wulfs struggled to follow. This was the energy fight he had mastered in China, applied with brutal efficiency to the European theater. The German pilots were disciplined, flying in rigid rote, pairs, and Schwarm, finger four, formations. They were trained to cover each other. But Howard was fighting a vertical war in a horizontal battle. He would appear from above, scatter a German attack, run on the bombers, and vanish back into the sun before they could bring their guns to bear. Inside the B-17 Hell's Angels, the war looked very different. Suspended in the plexiglass sphere of the ball turret, Staff Sergeant William Thompson had a front row seat to the impossible. For a ball turret gunner, combat was usually a terrifying, claustrophobic blur of flak bursts and incoming tracers. But today, Thompson wasn't firing. He was watching. He saw the lone Mustang tiny against the backdrop of the massive bomber stream, throwing itself against 30 enemy fighters. It was a frantic, violent ballet. Thompson keyed his throat microphone, his voice cracking over the interphone. One down. He got one. He's climbing back up. The bomber crews, men who had spent the last 20 minutes bracing for death, began to press their faces against the waist, windows, and cockpit glass. They saw the Mustang dive again. Howard was now fighting three separate battles simultaneously. The battle against the Germans, the battle against the G-forces crushing his body, and the battle against his own failing machine. The Germans, realizing this was a single lunatic American, tried to box him in. They attempted a sandwich maneuver. Two BF 109 seconds approached from the front, trying to lure him into a head-on pass, while a flight of few 190 seconds dove from above to nail him when he committed. It was a textbook trap. Howard saw it developing. He feigned a head-on attack, waiting until the last possible second until he could see the rivets on the German engine cowlings. Then, he snapped the Mustang into a violent skid, kicking the rudder hard while cross-controlling the ailerons. The P-51 slid sideways through the air. The German rounds passed harmlessly through the empty space where his cockpit had been a fraction of a second before. As the lead German fighter flashed past, Howard reversed his turn, dumping his nose to catch the second element. He pressed the trigger. The guns chattered, then died. He slammed the charging handles. Nothing. He banked hard, pulling 7 Gs, feeling the blood drain from his head, his vision graying out at the edges, the tunnel of consciousness narrowing to a pinhole. He eased off the stick just enough to let the blood return to his retinas. He had 3 working guns now, then 2. The Germans were relentless. They were flying the Focke-Wulf 190A, a butcher bird armed with 4 20mm cannons. A single hit from a 20mm shell would blow a wing off the Mustang. Howard was dancing between raindrops. 2 down, Sergeant Thompson shouted over the bomber net. He just flamed another one. Howard was disrupting the entire German intercept plan. The Luftwaffe doctrine relied on coordinated, massed attacks to break the B-17 seconds defensive boxes. But every time a German Staffel squadron lined up for a run, this silver nuisance would drop into their midst, forcing them to break formation to save themselves. He was buying the bombers time, minute by precious minute. But the clock was winning. At 11:30 a.m., Howard checked his fuel. The main fuselage tank was empty. He was running on his internal wing tanks. He checked his ammunition counters. They were dangerously low. He dove on a Bf-110 Zerstörer, a twin-engine heavy fighter that had drifted too close to the bombers. He lined up the shot, a perfect deflection angle. He squeezed. The left-wing guns fired a short burst and jammed solid. The right gun spit a few rounds and fell silent. He was down to one gun, one barrel, a few dozen rounds of ammunition. The German pilots, frustrated and embarrassed by their inability to kill this single fly, began to get aggressive. They stopped trying to trap him and simply tried to overwhelm him with volume of fire. Tracers zipped past his canopy, bright orange golf balls of death. He could hear the thwack-thwack of bullets punching through his aluminum skin. Howard ignored the damage. He saw a Bf-109 setting up on a B-17 that was trailing smoke. The bomber was a straggler, a dead man walking. The German pilot was steadying his aim, unaware of the Mustang closing from his high 6 o'clock. Howard pushed the throttle through the gate, overriding the engine limits. The Merlin screamed in protest. He closed the distance. He had to make this count. He waited until he was practically flying formation with the enemy. He pulled the trigger. The last remaining gun fired a 3-second burst. The rounds walked up the German's fuselage, shattering the cockpit glass. The 109 rolled inverted and plummeted toward the cloud deck. "3!" Thompson yelled, and then the last gun clicked dry. Howard was Winchester, 0 rounds, empty. He was 15,000 feet above enemy territory, outnumbered 20-1, with no way to shoot back. The rational, survivalist part of his brain, the part that kept pilots alive, screamed at him to dive for the deck and run for England. He had done his duty. He had saved lives. He was a hero. He could go home. But James Howard looked at the B-17 seconds. He saw the turrets spinning desperately. He saw the terrified faces of the waist gunners. He knew that if he left now, the Germans would regroup and slaughter them within minutes. He tightened his grip on the stick. The flying tiger didn't need teeth to bite. He just needed to look like he did. And that bluff began with a dive that defied every instinct of self-preservation James Howard possessed. With his ammunition counters reading empty and his guns cold, Howard spotted a Focke-Wulf 190 lining up for a slashing run on the lead bomber squadron. The German pilot was focused on the B-17, his thumb hovering over the firing button, waiting for the range to close. He didn't see the silver shape dropping from the zenith until it was too late. Howard shoved the stick forward, burying the nose of Ding Hao, and letting gravity accelerate the Mustang past 400 miles per hour. He roared down on the German's 6 o'clock position, filling the enemy pilot's rearview mirror with the terrifying silhouette of an attacking fighter. In aerial warfare, there is no time to verify if the gun on your tail is loaded. There is only the binary logic of survival. If a bandit is on your 6, you break or you die. The German pilot panicked. He violently kicked his rudder and rolled inverted, abandoning his attack run to dive for the safety of the cloud deck below. Howard didn't follow him. He didn't have to. He simply pulled up, trading his kinetic energy back for altitude, reclaiming his perch above the flock. He had neutralized an enemy fighter without firing a single shot. For the next 20 minutes, Howard engaged in a high-stakes game of psychological poker. He became a sheepdog, herding the Luftwaffe away from the 401st Bomb Group through sheer aggression. He would dive on a pair of Messerschmitts, forcing them to split. He would latch onto the tail of a straggler, chasing him down to 15,000 feet, miming a kill, until the terrified German pilot dove away in a panic. To the enemy, Howard was a relentless ace who seemed to be everywhere at once. They couldn't know that the terrifying American fighter was nothing more than a hollow shell of aluminum and gasoline. Inside the Hells Angels, the initial euphoria of the bomber crew had turned into confused awe. Lieutenant Robert Johnson, piloting the bomber, watched the Mustang swoop and dive with the grace of a trapeze artist. "Why isn't he shooting?" Johnson yelled over the roar of the engines. "He's dry, Skipper," Sergeant Thompson called back from the ball turret. "He's got to be dry. He's just chasing them off." The realization rippled through the bomber formation. The man protecting them wasn't fighting with bullets anymore. He was fighting with his life. He was placing his physical body between the 20mm cannons of the Luftwaffe and the B-17 seconds, using his aircraft as a shield. But while Howard could bluff the Germans, he couldn't bluff the laws of combustion. His fuel gauge was now tapping the red line. The Merlin engine consumed roughly 60 gallons of high-octane fuel per hour at cruise, but at combat power settings, it drank nearly double that. Howard had been fighting at full throttle for over 30 minutes. He was dangerously close to bingo fuel, the absolute minimum required to limp back to base. If he stayed another minute, he wouldn't be shot down. He would simply flame out and glide into a German POW camp. Then, on the western horizon, the cavalry arrived. A flight of P-47 Thunderbolts, painted with white identification stripes on their cowlings, appeared out of the gloom. The relief force. The German fighters, low on fuel themselves and frustrated by the obstinate resistance of the lone Mustang, turned east and disengaged. The sky over Oschersleben finally fell silent. Howard didn't join the formation. He didn't do a victory roll. He throttled back, leaned his fuel mixture to the absolute limit of starvation to save gas, and turned Ding Hao toward England. The flight home was a blur of exhaustion. The adrenaline that had kept his senses razor-sharp dumped out of his system, leaving him shaking and cold. His flight suit was soaked in sweat that was now freezing against his skin. He crossed the English coast with the needle of his fuel gauge resting on the empty peg. When the wheels of Ding Hao touched the tarmac at RAF Boxted, the engine sputtered and died before he could even taxi to the hardstand. The ground crew had to tow him in. Technical Sergeant Henry Rudowski, Howard's crew chief, climbed onto the wing to help the major out. He found Howard slumped in the seat, too weak to unbuckle his harness. But it was when Rudowski began to inspect the aircraft that the magnitude of the event became clear. The wings were riddled with bullet holes. A 20mm cannon shell had punched through the wing root, missing the main spar by inches. But the most chilling discovery was in the fuel tanks. They drained the remaining fuel to measure it. There were 11 gallons left. At combat power, 11 gallons is perhaps 3 minutes of flight time. Howard had cut it so close that a stiff headwind over the channel would have put him in the water. As Howard was helped to the debriefing hut, the intelligence officers were skeptical. A single pilot claiming 6 kills? Fighting alone for 30 minutes? It sounded like the hallucinations of a man suffering from hypoxia. They developed the gun camera film, expecting to see clouds and empty sky. Instead, the grainy black and white footage silenced the room. The film showed Focke-Wulfs disintegrating. It showed Messerschmitts exploding. It showed the violence of the first 10 minutes of the fight in undeniable clarity. But the film ended before the fight did. The real verification didn't come from the camera. It came from the bombers. Later that afternoon, the 401st Bomb Group landed at their base in Deenathorpe. Usually, bomber crews wanted nothing more than to hit the mess hall and sleep, but not today. The crews of 16 different B-17 seconds immediately sought out their intelligence officers. They all told the same story. They spoke of a lone P-51, call sign unknown, that had fought like a demon. He was a one-man air force, one gunner reported. He went round and round with them. He never left us. Word spread like wildfire through the 8th Air Force. The bomber crews, who usually viewed fighter pilots as glory hounds who left them at the border, demanded to know who the pilot was. When the flight logs were cross-referenced, the impossibility was confirmed. Major James Howard hadn't just survived the suicide mission that the brass had feared. He had rewritten the rulebook of escort tactics. He had proven that the P-51B, despite its jammed guns and fragile cooling system, was the weapon that could win the war. But his personal vindication was just the beginning. The shockwave of his 30 minutes over Oschersleben was about to travel all the way to the headquarters of the U.S. Army Air Forces and change the doctrine of aerial warfare forever. That shockwave didn't just rattle the windows of the debriefing huts. It blew the doors off the tactical doctrine of the United States Army Air Forces. When General Ira Eaker, the commander of the 8th Air Force, read the combat reports from January 11th, he didn't wait for the paperwork to clear through the Pentagon. He personally interviewed Howard and immediately recommended him for the Medal of Honor. 6 weeks later, Major James Howard stood on the tarmac at Boxted while a general pinned the pale blue ribbon around his neck. He became the only fighter pilot in the entire European theater of operations to receive the nation's highest award during the war. But the medal was, in many ways, just a piece of metal. The real award was the order that followed it, issued by the man who took command of the 8th Air Force just days after Howard's mission, Major General Jimmy Doolittle. Doolittle was a legend, the man who had bombed Tokyo in 1942, and he looked at air warfare with the cold precision of a racing pilot. When he arrived in England, he found a fighter force that was leashed. The standing order for all fighter groups was defensive. The first duty of the 8th Air Force fighters is to bring the bombers back alive. This meant that American fighters were chained to the bomber stream. If the Luftwaffe didn't attack, the Mustangs and Thunderbolts had to sit there, frustratingly passive, watching German airfields pass below them untouched. They were bodyguards, waiting to be punched. Howard's mission changed the calculus. He had proven that a single P-51 could engage the enemy on their own terms, deep inside the Reich, and survive. He had proven that the Mustang wasn't just an escort, it was a hunter. Doolittle walked into the headquarters and famously ordered the defensive sign torn down. In its place, he issued a new directive, one of the most aggressive in military history. The first duty of the 8th Air Force fighters is to destroy the German Air Force. The leash was cut. Doolittle unleashed the Mustangs to conduct ultimate pursuit. They were no longer required to hug the bombers. They were authorized to roam. They began to drop down to treetop level, strafing German airfields, blowing up locomotives, and hunting the Luftwaffe where they lived. They forced the Germans into a war of attrition they could not win. This strategic pivot broke the back of the Luftwaffe. By the spring of 1944, the Germans weren't running out of planes, they were running out of pilots. The veterans were dead, shot down by roving wolf packs of Mustangs, and the replacements were being killed before they could learn to fight. But as historians and enthusiasts celebrate the P-51 as the plane that won the war, they often make a critical error. They picture the silver, bubble canopy P-51D, the Cadillac of the skies that you see at air shows today. James Howard didn't fly a Cadillac. He flew the prototype. The D model, which arrived months later, was the perfected machine. The engineers finally fixed the fatal flaw that had nearly killed Howard. They redesigned the wing root, making it slightly thicker, which allowed the .50 caliber guns to be mounted upright. This eliminated the sharp, jamming-prone bend in the feed chutes. The P-51D had guns that worked in a high G turn. It had a bubble canopy with 360-degree visibility. It was the finished product. James Howard had none of that. He fought the defining battle of the air war in the P-51B, a plane with limited rear visibility and a gun feed system that failed under stress. He fought with the beta version of the technology. This technical context elevates his performance from heroic to miraculous. It is one thing to win a fight when your equipment is superior. It is another thing entirely to win when your weapon jams in the first minute of a 30-minute brawl. Howard didn't rely on the machine to do the work. He compensated for the machine's failures with his own brilliance. He was the bridge between the era of desperate defense and the era of total air supremacy. He took a flawed, unproven aircraft into the heart of darkness and showed the world that it was enough. The B-17 crews never forgot him. For decades after the war, at reunions across America, men from the 401st Bomb Group would tell their grandchildren about the Lone Ranger of Oschersleben. They didn't know about the laminar flow wings or the angled feed chutes. They didn't know about Doolittle's doctrine. They only knew that on the coldest day of the year, when the sky was full of wolves, one man stood his ground so that 600 of them could go home. Howard survived the war, eventually retiring as a brigadier general. He lived a quiet life, rarely speaking of the mission unless pressed. But the legacy of that half-hour fight is written in the contrails of every air superiority fighter that flies today. The concept of offensive counter-air, the idea that you defend your assets by destroying the enemy's ability to fly, was forged in the frozen skies over Oschersleben. James Howard proved that technology is only as good as the pilot who wields it. He showed us that when the guns jam and the odds are impossible, the deadliest weapon in the sky isn't the plane. It's the will to fight. That will carried James Howard far beyond the cockpit of Ding Hao. After the war, the man who had single-handedly engaged an entire Luftwaffe wing didn't seek the spotlight. He didn't write tell-all books or chase Hollywood fame. He quietly transitioned into the jet age, rising to the rank of brigadier general, helping to shape the United States Air Force into a modern superpower. When he passed away in 1995, he was one of the last surviving links to a generation that viewed heroism not as an exception, but as a job requirement. But as we close the dossier on the Oschersleben raid, we must look at this event through the eyes of an architect, not just a storyteller. The miracle of January 11th wasn't magic. It was the inevitable collision of three specific forces. First, you had the machine, the P-51B Mustang. It was flawed, yes. Its guns jammed, and its engine was temperamental. But it possessed the one metric that mattered: energy retention. It gave the pilot the option to leave. Second, you had the crisis. The 8th Air Force was bleeding to death. The doctrine of unescorted bombing had failed. The system was desperate for a proof of concept that could stop the slaughter. And third, you had the man. If any other pilot had been in that cockpit, a pilot trained only in Army formation flying, they likely would have followed orders and turned back, or died trying to turn with a Focke-Wulf. James Howard survived because he was a flying tiger first. He applied the hard-won physics of the Pacific theater dive / zoom to the frozen skies of Europe. He was the perfect software running on imperfect hardware. James Howard broke the Luftwaffe's back in the stratosphere, proving that a single fighter could dominate the high ground. But on the other side of the world, deep in the humid jungles of New Guinea, another American officer was looking at the air war from a very different angle. He was a middle-aged, unauthorized tinkerer who looked at the B-25 Mitchell bomber and decided it didn't have enough guns. While Howard was fighting at 30,000 feet, this man was figuring out how to fight at 50 feet, skipping bombs off the water like stones to sink the Japanese Navy. His name was Paul "Pappy" Gunn, and his mad science experiments at the Battle of the Bismarck Sea are the subject of our next briefing. If you want to understand the engineering behind the history, the nuts, bolts, and physics that decided the fate of nations, make sure you are subscribed and have your notifications active. This is the military